They laughed when she grabbed the rifle, until she outshot the entire unit. The mockery turned to silence as shell casings hit the ground. Her hands, steady as stone, proved what her words never could. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. John Smith had always been underestimated. At 22, she barely reached 5 feet 2 inches and weighed just over 100 pounds. Her delicate features and quiet voice made people assume she was fragile, someone in need of protection rather than a capable recruit. That assumption had followed her throughout life, but nowhere was it more apparent than in the brutal Nebraska military training camp she now called home. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as dust swirled across the parade ground. 30 recruits stood at rigid attention, sweat already soaking through their identical uniforms despite the early hour. John was the only woman among them, a fact that hadn't gone unnoticed by anyone, least of all herself. "Eyes forward, back straight," Drill Sergeant Robert Johnson's voice thundered across the yard, his weathered face scanning the line with practiced scrutiny. The 15-year veteran moved with the confidence of someone who had broken and rebuilt countless recruits before them. When his gaze landed on John, she detected the familiar flicker of doubt she'd seen in so many eyes before. For 3 grueling weeks, she'd endured the sidelong glances and barely concealed snickers. The whispers followed her everywhere, in the mess hall, during physical training, and especially during combat exercises. Men like Michael Davis from Alabama and Robert Brown, the former linebacker, dominated the social hierarchy with their booming voices and displays of physical prowess. "Smith, center that helmet," the drill sergeant barked, and John adjusted it quickly, feeling the eyes of 29 men on her. She'd learned to keep her face expressionless, to absorb the judgment without revealing how deeply it cut. Yesterday, Daniel Garcia had loudly wondered if she'd make it through the first month. $50 says she requests transfer by week 4, he'd announced to appreciative laughter in the barracks. Kevin Johnson had upped the ante. $75 says she cries during the next endurance run. What none of them knew was that John had spent her childhood summers at her grandfather's Montana ranch, learning resilience that had nothing to do with size. The old Korean War veteran had taught her that true strength rarely announced itself with flexed muscles or loud declarations. As the morning drill continued under the punishing Nebraska sun, John focused on the horizon beyond the training grounds. She didn't need their approval or understanding. For now, surviving each day was victory enough. The men around her might think toughness came from calloused hands or old football trophies, but John Smith knew better. She would show them, not with words, but with actions, exactly what she was made of. "Today, we separate real soldiers from wannabes," barked Sergeant Robert Johnson, his sunburned face scanning the trembling lineup. The morning sun glinted off his polished insignia as he paced before them, boots kicking up small clouds of Nebraska dust. Marksmanship training begins now. Don't think you know how to shoot just because you've hunted deer with your dad or played some video games. Military precision is a different beast. The recruits shuffled nervously toward the shooting range, a stretch of parched earth bordered by earthen berms. Rows of military-grade rifles gleamed on a battered wooden table, each one meticulously arranged by the range officers. John Smith hung back slightly, conscious of the sideways glances from her fellow recruits. Her small frame felt especially vulnerable as the others jostled forward, eager to prove themselves. She had never fired a weapon like this before. The rifles looked heavier, more intimidating than anything she'd handled previously. But as she approached, memories surfaced unbidden. Summer afternoons at her grandfather's Montana ranch, the old man's patient voice guiding her as she learned to handle his weathered .22 rifle. "Breathe with the gun," he'd told her. "Let it become part of your arm. Each of you will demonstrate basic firing position before attempting your first shots," Sergeant Johnson continued, lifting one of the weapons with practiced ease. "This isn't about strength. It's about discipline and control." Michael Davis pushed forward, his burly frame commanding space. "Sir, I've been shooting since I could walk," he announced, Alabama drawl thick with confidence. Several recruits nodded appreciatively at his assertion. John found herself studying the rifles with quiet intensity. Would those childhood lessons translate to this military setting? The fundamentals her grandfather had drilled into her, stance, grip, breath control, seemed worlds away from this dusty Nebraska training ground. Robert Brown flexed his former linebacker's shoulders as he eyed the weapons. "Can't be that different from football," he muttered to Daniel Garcia. "All about focus and execution, right?" The drill sergeant overheard him. "Brown, shooting isn't a game where you can muscle your way through. One twitch, one moment of lost concentration, and you failed." His gaze swept over the group, lingering briefly on John's slight figure. Sometimes the least likely recruit makes the best marksman. John felt her heart quicken. She wondered if those words were meant for her, or if she was projecting her own desperate hope to find her place here. As they lined up to receive their weapons, she steeled herself. Those long-ago lessons on her grandfather's ranch might be her only advantage in a world that already expected her to fail. Michael Davis stepped forward with the swagger of someone who'd spent his life proving himself. The Alabama native's broad shoulders and confident stride commanded attention as he approached the weapons table. "Been shooting since I was 8, he announced, his southern drawl carrying across the range. "Bagged my first buck at 12. This'll be a walk in the park." His voice boomed intentionally loud, ensuring everyone, especially the instructors, could hear his credentials. The other recruits nodded appreciatively, drawn to his easy bravado like moths to flame. Several of them exchanged glances of approval, clearly marking Michael as someone to align with. Sergeant Johnson remained stone-faced, having heard similar boasts from countless recruits over his 15 years of service. "Is that right, Davis?" The sergeant replied flatly. "We'll see if hunting squirrels translates to military precision." Michael simply grinned, unfazed by the subtle challenge. He hefted the rifle with practiced ease, making a show of examining it, as though appraising its quality. The morning sun glinted off the weapon's metal parts as he turned it in his hands. "Sir, my daddy was military too. Taught me everything about handling firearms before I could ride a bike," he added, cementing his position as the group's self-appointed shooting expert. Behind him, Robert Brown stepped up next. The former college linebacker's athletic frame dwarfed most of the other recruits. He'd been a star on his university team before deciding the military offered better opportunities than his slim chances at professional sports. Robert flexed his biceps dramatically as he picked up his assigned rifle, the muscles in his arms bulging beneath his uniform. "This got some kick? I'm used to heavy equipment. This'll be nothing." He spun the weapon with casual disregard for proper handling, earning a sharp glare from Sergeant Johnson. "Brown, that's not a toy. Treat it with respect or you'll be running laps until sunset," the sergeant barked. The reprimand did little to dampen the atmosphere of masculine competition that had taken hold. Laughter rippled through the group as the recruits jostled for position in the unspoken hierarchy forming among them. Then John Smith stepped forward, her small frame moving with quiet determination toward the weapons table. The snickers that had been background noise suddenly sharpened like knives, cutting through the air with unmistakable intent. "Look at that," Daniel whispered loudly to Kevin. "Think she can even lift it?" The mockery wasn't subtle, nor was it meant to be. Several recruits didn't bother hiding their amusement as John reached for her assigned rifle. The weight of their judgment hung heavier than any weapon as she prepared to take her place in the firing line. "Hey, Princess, you sure you can handle that?" called out Daniel Garcia, a stocky recruit from Detroit. His voice carried across the range, drawing attention from the other trainees. "That rifle might be heavier than you are." The laughter swelled like a wave, rippling through the group of men. Even the quieter recruits who had mostly kept to themselves couldn't hide their smirks. John Smith stood rigid, her 5'2" frame seeming to shrink further under their scrutiny. She'd faced this exact scenario countless times before, In school, in training, in every space where being small and female made her an automatic target. "Maybe we should get her a water gun instead," added Kevin Johnson, his comments sending another wave of chuckles through the group. A few of the men nudged each other, enjoying the spectacle. "Or one of those toy rifles from the dollar store." Robert Brown, the former linebacker, made a show of hefting his weapon. "This is military equipment, Smith, not exactly designed for someone like you." He emphasized the word "you" with unmistakable condescension. John's cheeks burned with a familiar heat, but she kept her expression flat and unreadable. The Nebraska sun beat down on the training ground, making the metal of the rifles gleam. She'd learned long ago, watching her grandfather handle mockery from younger hunters, that reacting would only make things worse. Showing anger or hurt would just give them ammunition for weeks to come. Sergeant Johnson observed from several yards away, his weathered face revealing nothing. He'd seen this dynamic play out countless times before, the pack mentality, the targeting of anyone different. But his years of experience had taught him to let certain situations resolve naturally. Quietly, John stepped forward and picked up one of the military-grade rifles from the table. The weapon was indeed heavy in her hands, heavier than her grandfather's old .22, but the weight felt oddly reassuring. The metal was warm from sitting in the sun, the grip textured against her palms. "Better be careful, Smith," Michael Davis called out, his Alabama drawl thickened for effect. "Kickback might send you flying back to Montana." John adjusted her stance slightly, finding her balance with the unfamiliar weight. The rifle was substantial, but not intimidating. She remembered her grandfather's words from years ago. "It's not about strength, Johnny. It's about knowing your center." She looked down the line of smirking recruits, then back at the weapon in her hands. For a brief moment, a flicker of determination crossed her face, so quick that only Sergeant Johnson, watching carefully, caught it before her expression returned to neutral. The laughter continued, but John was already measuring the weight, feeling the balance, preparing. She wasn't intimidated, not by the rifle and not by them. Sergeant Robert Johnson stood at the front of the group, his weathered face set in its perpetual scowl as he demonstrated the proper stance. His movements were precise, economical, the result of thousands of repetitions over 15 years of service. "Listen up," he barked, adjusting a recruit's grip on the rifle. "Marksmanship isn't about being big or strong. That's what most of you meatheads don't understand." His eyes swept across the muscular frames of Michael Davis and Robert Brown. "It's focus, patience, control. The best snipers I ever knew weren't the obvious choices. Sometimes the quiet ones surprise you." John Smith watched intently, absorbing every detail. The way the drill sergeant planted his feet shoulder-width apart. How he tucked the stock firmly against his shoulder. The rhythmic pattern of his breathing before he squeezed, not pulled, the trigger. As the instructor continued his demonstration, John's mind drifted to sun-drenched afternoons in Montana, standing beside her grandfather on his ranch. The old veteran had placed his hands over hers, adjusting her grip on his weathered .22 rifle. "Shooting isn't about forcing the gun," he'd said in his gentle voice, so different from Sergeant Johnson's bark. "It's about becoming one with it. Let it be an extension of your eye, your breath, your intention." The memory was so vivid she could almost smell the pine trees and feel the Montana breeze against her cheek. Her grandfather had never rushed her, never mocked her small frame. Instead, he taught her that her size could be an advantage. A lower center of gravity, less muscle tension to fight. "Smith, you with us?" Sergeant Johnson's voice snapped her back to the present. The Nebraska heat pressed down on the training ground, so different from those Montana summers. "Yes, Sergeant," she replied, straightening her posture. The recruits began lining up at the filing line, facing the stationary targets positioned 50 yards away. John felt her heart quicken as she waited her turn. Daniel Garcia made a show of cracking his knuckles, while Kevin Johnson pantomimed shooting motions to the amusement of those around him. John took a deep breath, trying to calm the flutter in her stomach. She'd shot countless times before, but never with so many eyes watching, judging, waiting for her to fail. The weight of their expectations, or rather their lack of expectations, pressed down heavier than the Nebraska sun. Yet beneath the nerves, a small flame kindled. This was her element. For the first time since arriving at the training camp, she wasn't at a disadvantage. As she watched the other recruits prepare, adjusting their stances with varying degrees of confidence, John felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. A flicker of hope. Michael Davis stepped up to the firing line with a swagger that had become his trademark. Adjusting his stance with theatrical precision, he winked at the other recruits watching from behind. The burly Alabaman handled the rifle with the casual confidence of someone who'd grown up with firearms as constant companions. "Watch and learn," he muttered just loud enough for those nearby to hear. 5 rapid shots echoed across the range. As the sound faded, the results became visible. 3 rounds had merely clipped the outer edge of the target, 1 had missed completely, and only 1 had grazed anywhere near the center. The confident smile on his face faltered momentarily before he recovered. "Just warming up," Michael announced, his voice noticeably less booming than before. "First round's always about getting a feel for the weapon." He handed the rifle to the next recruit, his swagger diminished as he rejoined the group. Robert Brown approached the line next, flexing his substantial biceps as if preparing for a weightlifting competition rather than a precision exercise. The former linebacker handled the military firearm with obvious strength but little finesse. "This thing's lighter than my gym bag," he joked, drawing a few chuckles from the group. His performance proved unremarkable. All 5 shots hit the target, but they formed a scattered pattern that showed little control. The shots were decent enough to pass basic requirements, but nothing that would impress Sergeant Johnson, who observed with arms crossed and a neutral expression. Daniel Garcia took his position with determination etched on his face. The stocky recruit from Detroit had been one of the loudest mockers of John Smith, and he clearly felt pressure to perform. His breathing was uneven as he squeezed off his rounds. While Daniel managed to hit the target with all 5 shots, technically better than Michael's attempt, his rounds scattered wildly across the paper, showing no grouping or precision. He returned to the line with a forced smile, avoiding eye contact with the sergeant. One by one, the other recruits took their turns. Kevin Johnson hit 4 out of 5 targets but missed the center completely. Tommy Wilson, a quiet recruit who rarely joined the mockery, managed a respectable grouping, but still nothing exceptional. As each recruit completed their turn, a pattern emerged. They were all passing, but barely. Most had hunting experience or had fired weapons before, but military precision shooting was proving to be exactly what Sergeant Johnson had warned, a different beast entirely. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the bar of mediocrity was firmly established, with no one managing to rise above it. The group's collective confidence was visibly deflating with each average performance. No one had truly stood out, yet. As John's turn came, the jokes resumed with new energy. Daniel Garcia nudged Kevin Johnson with his elbow. "Bet she can't even hit the target," he whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Kevin snickered and added, "This'll be good for a laugh." The comments rippled through the group, creating an atmosphere thick with mockery. Every eye was on John Smith as she walked to the firing line. Her petite frame seemed even smaller against the backdrop of the Nebraska training ground, dust swirling around her boots. The weight of their expectations, or lack of them, pressed on her shoulders like a physical burden. Michael Davis crossed his arms, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he waited for the inevitable failure. "Let's see what you've got, Smith," Sergeant Johnson called out, his voice neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply professional. John picked up the military-grade rifle, feeling its substantial weight. She assumed the stance that the drill sergeant had demonstrated minutes earlier, feet planted shoulder-width apart. But something felt wrong. The position was mechanical, textbook perfect, yet foreign to her body. Instinctively, she shifted her weight slightly, adjusting her center of gravity lower. Her hands found their natural placement on the weapon, fingers relaxing their grip just enough, just as her grandfather had taught her during those long summer afternoons in Montana. The old veteran's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, "The rifle isn't separate from you, it's an extension of your body." As she made these subtle adjustments, Robert Brown nudged another recruit. "Look at her changing the stance. Thinks she knows better than the sergeant." But his mockery lacked its usual conviction as he watched her transformation. The rifle, which had felt awkward and unwieldy in her hands moments before, now seemed to settle into her grip, as if it belonged there. Her breathing slowed naturally. Her shoulders relaxed, and her focus narrowed until the jeers and whispers around her faded to a distant hum. Sergeant Johnson watched with narrowed eyes, noting how the smallest recruit in his unit had instinctively modified his instructions. In 15 years of training soldiers, he'd learned to recognize when someone was fighting the weapon versus working with it. Despite himself, a flicker of interest sparked in his experienced gaze. "Whenever you're ready, Smith," he said, his tone betraying nothing of his thoughts. John took a deep breath, her finger hovering near the trigger. The target seemed to grow clearer in her vision as everything else, the dust, the heat, the doubters, blurred into insignificance. In this moment, there was only her, the rifle, and the distant paper target that would either validate or destroy her place among these men. John Smith took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the military rifle against her shoulder. The familiar words of her grandfather echoed in her mind like a prayer. "Don't fight the gun. Let it show you." Her small frame settled into a stance that felt natural rather than forced. The Nebraska sun beat down on the shooting range, but she barely noticed the heat now. She lined up the sights with practiced precision, her delicate fingers steady on the weapon. Inhale, hold, exhale halfway. She squeezed the trigger with deliberate control. The rifle barked, its recoil flowing through her body like a wave she'd been riding all her life. Without hesitation, she was already realigning for her next shot, muscle memory taking over before the first round had even reached the target. Behind her, the laughter that had followed her for weeks faded into a strange, heavy silence. The usual commentary from Michael Davis and Robert Brown was conspicuously absent. Even Daniel Garcia, who'd been the loudest with his jokes about Princess handling a weapon, stood speechless. John fired her second shot with the same fluid motion, then her third. Each time she embraced the recoil rather than fighting it, just as her grandfather had taught her during those Montana summers. The rhythm became almost meditative. Aim, breathe, squeeze, reset. Her fourth shot followed the same pattern, and then her fifth completed the sequence. When she lowered the weapon, the silence behind her had transformed into something tangible, like a physical presence on the range. She turned to see 29 pairs of eyes fixed on her, expressions ranging from disbelief to reluctant admiration. Sergeant Johnson stood at the spotting scope, his sunburned face unreadable as he assessed her target. The drill sergeant's eyebrows arched upward in unmistakable surprise. He glanced at John, then back at the target, as if confirming what he was seeing. The quiet stretched longer, becoming uncomfortable as the recruits shifted their weight from one foot to another. "Well," Sergeant Johnson finally said, his gruff voice carrying across the range, "looks like someone's been holding out on us." The 15-year veteran straightened up from the scope and gave John a look that, while not quite a smile, held something she hadn't seen before: respect. The petite recruit felt a flutter of pride in her chest, carefully contained but warming her from within. For the first time since arriving at the training camp, John didn't feel like an outsider. The rifle in her hands had spoken a language everyone present understood. and it had said more about her than weeks of trying to prove herself ever could. 4 shots clustered tightly in the center ring, the 5th just barely outside, tighter than anything anyone else had managed. The silence stretched, heavy with realization. Sergeant Johnson squinted through the spotting scope again, his weathered face betraying genuine surprise. He stepped back, gesturing for Michael to take a look. The burly Alabamian's swagger vanished as he peered through the scope, his jaw tightening. "Well, I'll be damned," Sergeant Johnson finally said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Smith, where'd you learn to shoot like that?" John Smith carefully placed the military rifle back on the rack, her movements deliberate and respectful of the weapon. "My grandfather taught me the basics, Sergeant," she replied, her quiet voice carrying across the now silent range. The other recruits shifted uncomfortably. Daniel Garcia stared at his own target sheet with its scattered pattern of holes, suddenly finding the ground fascinating. Robert Brown crossed his muscular arms, his expression unreadable as he reassessed the petite recruit he dismissed just minutes earlier. "Beginner's luck," Kevin Johnson muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. The smallest, quietest member of the unit had just outshot every single recruit in her first attempt. The whispers that had followed John through 3 weeks of training vanished, replaced by murmurs and shuffling feet. Some recruits exchanged glances, recalibrating their assumptions about the only woman in their group. "Luck doesn't cluster shots like that," Sergeant Johnson said, addressing the entire unit. "That's skill and focus." He turned to John. "Tomorrow, we'll see if you can repeat it." As the group moved to the next station, the usual chatter was subdued. Michael Davis, who'd boasted about hunting since childhood, kept glancing back at John with a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. The dynamic had shifted, subtle but unmistakable. For her part, John maintained her composure, face calm and movements measured. But inside, for the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of confidence igniting. Not pride or arrogance, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing her grandfather's lessons hadn't been forgotten. The weight of proving herself hadn't lifted entirely, but it had lightened, just enough to stand a little straighter. As she followed the unit to their next exercise, John caught Sergeant Johnson studying her with newfound interest. The veteran soldier nodded slightly, a gesture so small others might have missed it. But John saw it and understood its meaning. She had earned something today. Not acceptance, not yet, but notice. And in this environment, that was no small victory. By dinner time, word of John Smith's marksmanship prowess had raced through the Nebraska training camp like wildfire. Each retelling added new embellishments to the story. In the East Barracks, recruits claimed she'd hit 5 perfect bullseyes without breaking a sweat. The West Barracks version had her shooting with eyes closed. By the time the tale reached the officers' quarters, some were saying she'd outshot instructors who'd been teaching for decades. In the mess hall, Michael Davis hunched over his tray, stabbing at his mashed potatoes with unusual aggression. The burly Alabama native who had boasted about his hunting expertise now sat isolated, his usual entourage notably absent. His stories about tracking deer since childhood suddenly felt hollow against the afternoon's undeniable demonstration. "It was just beginner's luck," he muttered to a group of recruits at the neighboring table, loud enough for others to hear. "First-timers sometimes get lucky. The nerves haven't kicked in yet." He shoveled food into his mouth, avoiding eye contact. "Wait until we have real shooting exercises with movement and pressure. That's when experience counts." Across the room, Robert Brown, the former linebacker, nodded vigorously while explaining to anyone who would listen. "Paper targets aren't combat," he insisted, flexing unconsciously as he gripped his fork. "Standing still in perfect conditions? That's nothing. Let's see her handle stress positions, or after a 5-mile run." Daniel Garcia joined their table, dropping his tray with a clatter. "My cousin's in Special Forces," the Detroit recruit announced. He says women always crack under real pressure. It's biology or something. Kevin Johnson snickered in agreement, but the laughter that followed sounded forced, lacking the easy confidence of previous days. Their bravado rang hollow, like an empty drum trying to sound impressive. At the far end of the mess hall, John ate quietly, aware of the sideways glances and whispers. She kept her eyes down, focusing on her meal rather than the attention. This wasn't the first time she'd upset expectations, though never on this scale. Sergeant Johnson entered the hall, his presence immediately quieting several conversations. His weathered face revealed nothing as he scanned the room, briefly making eye contact with John before moving on. The 15-year veteran had seen enough recruits come and go to recognize something unusual when he saw it. As the evening progressed, the excuses and explanations continued, but with diminishing conviction. Something had shifted in the unit's dynamic, a small crack in the foundation of assumptions that had seemed so solid just that morning. No one could quite articulate it, but everyone felt it. The uncomfortable realization that perhaps they had been wrong all along. Sergeant Robert Johnson watched the other recruits file away from the range, their swagger noticeably diminished. 15 years in the military had taught him to recognize raw talent when he saw it, and what John Smith had demonstrated wasn't just good, it was exceptional. As the Nebraska sun began its descent, painting the dusty training grounds in amber hues, he gestured for her to stay behind. "Smith," he called, his voice lacking its usual drill sergeant edge. "A word." John approached cautiously, her small frame tense with anticipation. She'd learned to expect criticism or backhanded compliments, not genuine conversation. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Johnson asked, studying her with newfound interest. The gruffness that typically characterized his interactions with recruits had softened, replaced by genuine curiosity. John hesitated, a complex swirl of emotions crossing her delicate features. Memories of Montana summers flooded back, the scent of pine, the weight of her grandfather's hand steadying her shoulder. "My grandfather taught me when I was a kid, sir," she finally answered, her quiet voice steady. "He was a Korean War vet, hunted a lot when he came back stateside." She paused, remembering the old man's weathered face. Said it helped him find peace after everything he'd seen. Johnson nodded thoughtfully, leaning against the wooden post of the shooting shelter. The veteran recognized the familiar story. Many soldiers found solace in the focus and discipline of marksmanship after combat. "That's a good foundation," he acknowledged. "But what you did today goes beyond teaching." He gestured toward the targets where her tight grouping had silenced a platoon of doubters. That kind of precision, that instinct for compensating without overthinking, that's raw talent, Smith, the kind that can't be taught. The evening breeze carried the distant sounds of the base, recruits heading to the mess hall, vehicles rumbling along perimeter roads. For a moment, neither spoke. "What do you want to do with it?" Johnson finally asked, his question hanging in the air between them. John blinked, caught off guard. Since arriving at the training camp, her only goal had been survival, enduring the whispers, proving she belonged. The idea that her skill might open doors rather than just silence critics was something she hadn't dared consider. "I'm not sure, sir," she admitted. "I just wanted to make it through basic." The sergeant's expression shifted to something resembling respect, a look John hadn't received from anyone since arriving. "Well, start thinking bigger, Smith," he said. "Talent like yours shouldn't be wasted, and I know a few people who might be interested in seeing what else you can do." Sergeant Johnson's question echoed in John Smith's mind as she lay on her bunk that night. "What do you want to do with it?" For weeks, her sole focus had been survival, proving that her small frame and quiet demeanor didn't define her capabilities. She'd entered this Nebraska training camp just wanting to belong, to silence the doubters. But now, possibility stretched before her like an unexplored horizon. The next morning dawned with a merciless sun beating down on the shooting range. The air shimmered with heat as Sergeant Johnson announced the day's challenge. Targets positioned at 100 yards, with unpredictable crosswinds gusting across the field. The difficulty had increased tenfold. Weather conditions are part of marksmanship, the sergeant explained, his sunburned face serious. The best shooters don't just see the target, they feel the environment. Daniel Garcia stepped up first, jaw clenched with determination. After yesterday's humiliation, the stocky recruit from Detroit was desperate to redeem himself. He planted his feet firmly, aimed with exaggerated care, and fired. His first shot clipped the outer edge of the target. His second missed entirely. By his fifth shot, frustration had taken over, and his results scattered wildly across the paper. "Wind's messing with me," he muttered, stepping back with reddened cheeks. Kevin followed, his earlier jokes about John replaced by grim concentration. But the results were no better. The crosswind carried his shots astray, and the glaring sun seemed to blur his vision. Even with squinted eyes and adjusted stance, he couldn't compensate for the conditions. Michael Davis approached with his familiar swagger, though it seemed more forced today. "Just need to account for the drift," he announced, to no one in particular. The burly Alabaman who'd boasted about hunting since childhood fired his rounds with confidence. But the results told a different story. 3 shots landed on target, but nowhere near center mass. 2 others missed completely. John watched them all carefully, noting their mistakes. They were fighting the conditions rather than working with them. Her grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in her ear. "Nature always wins if you oppose it. Learn to dance with the wind instead." As the others finished their attempts, John felt a strange calm settle over her. Yesterday's success hadn't been luck. It had been the result of proper training and natural ability. For the first time since arriving at camp, she wasn't questioning whether she belonged. Instead, she was wondering just how far her talent might take her, if she had the courage to pursue it. Sergeant Johnson caught her eye and nodded slightly. They both knew that today's challenge would separate those with potential from those with genuine skill, and John was ready to discover which category she truly belonged in. When John stepped to the line, the whispers were different, skepticism mixed with anticipation. The morning had brought challenging conditions, swirling winds that changed direction every few minutes, and bright sunlight that created harsh shadows across the range. Several recruits had already taken their turns, their frustration evident as the wind carried their shots off target. "Let's see if yesterday was just beginner's luck," Michael Davis muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. The burly Alabamian crossed his arms, his earlier confidence noticeably diminished after his own disappointing performance. John Smith ignored the commentary, focusing instead on the environment around her. She studied the way the tall Nebraska grass bent and swayed, watched the fluttering red indicator flags at various distances, and felt the breeze against her cheek. The lessons from her childhood echoed in her mind, her grandfather's patient voice on those Montana afternoons. "The wind isn't your enemy, Johnny. Learn to dance with it. Watch how it moves, respect its power, then use it." She took a deep breath and adjusted her stance slightly, angling her body to account for the crosswind. The rifle felt natural in her hands now, like an extension of herself rather than a foreign object. The young recruit settled into her rhythm. Inhale, slight pause, exhale halfway, then squeeze the trigger with deliberate pressure. The first shot cracked through the air. Through the spotting scope, Sergeant Johnson nodded approvingly. The bullet had struck just left of center, perfectly compensating for wind drift. Not luck, calculation. John realigned, adjusted minutely for the shifting breeze, and fired again, dead center. Her third shot followed the same path, creating a tight grouping that even the most experienced shooters would envy. By her fourth shot, the entire range had fallen silent, all eyes fixed on the small figure handling the military weapon with unexpected mastery. Her fifth and final shot completed a pattern so tight that Sergeant Robert Johnson actually removed his cap and ran a hand over his close-cropped hair in disbelief. "Smith," he called out, his voice carrying across the now-silent range, "you're not just hitting targets. You're reading conditions better than people who've been shooting for decades." Daniel Garcia, who had struggled mightily with the wind conditions, stared open-mouthed at the target display. Kevin Johnson nudged Robert Brown, both men exchanging glances that mixed disbelief with grudging respect. The quiet recruit returned the rifle to its resting position and stepped back from the line, her face betraying no emotion despite the triumph. She hadn't just survived the challenge, she had mastered it, transforming what others saw as obstacles into advantages, just as her grandfather had taught her years ago. John Smith's performance hadn't just maintained its impressive standard, it had actually improved. The wind had picked up, creating challenging conditions that had frustrated even the most experienced recruits. Yet she had adjusted with an almost intuitive precision. Sergeant Robert Johnson shook his head in disbelief as he examined her target through his spotting scope, the tight grouping of shots speaking volumes. "Smith," he said, lowering the scope and turning to face her, "in 15 years of training recruits, I've never seen natural ability like this." His typically gruff voice had softened slightly, replaced with genuine admiration. "Ever thought about specialized marksmanship training? Sniper school? Competitive shooting?" The suggestion sent an electric jolt through John's body. A new path was opening before her, one she hadn't even considered possible when she'd first arrived at the Nebraska training facility. But it was also a path lined with higher expectations and even more scrutiny. As the only woman in her unit, she already lived under a microscope. Advanced training would only intensify that pressure. "I hadn't thought that far ahead, Sergeant," she replied, her quiet voice steady despite her racing thoughts. "I've been focused on getting through each day here." Johnson nodded, understanding in his weathered face. "Well, start thinking about it. Talent like yours shouldn't be wasted on standard infantry work." That evening, word of John's exceptional performance reached the base commander's office. Colonel Mary Davis, a decorated 30-year veteran with 3 combat tours under her belt, requested a meeting with the recruit everyone was talking about. The colonel had broken her own barriers throughout her military career and followed the progress of promising female recruits with particular interest. Back in the barracks, the mood had shifted noticeably. Michael Davis still scowled whenever John entered the room. His Alabama hunting stories no longer drawing the same admiring audience. Robert Brown had stopped making jokes at her expense, instead watching her with thoughtful consideration during training exercises. Even Daniel and Kevin maintained a respectful distance, their earlier mockery replaced by uncertain nods of acknowledgement. John sat on her bunk, polishing her boots with methodical precision. Tomorrow she would meet Colonel Davis, and the thought filled her with both anticipation and anxiety. She wondered what her grandfather would say if he could see her now, the quiet girl he taught to shoot on his Montana ranch, now being considered for elite military training. The ridicule that had greeted her when she first picked up a military rifle had transformed into something she found almost more difficult to navigate: respect. "Smith, your scores are impressive," Colonel Mary Davis told her in a crisp, sunlit office adorned with awards and photographs documenting 3 decades of military service. The morning light caught the polished medals displayed in a glass case behind her desk. "Sergeant Johnson says you're a natural. I've reviewed your file myself, and I must say, I'm intrigued." John stood at attention, her small frame casting a diminutive shadow across the immaculate floor. The colonel's reputation preceded her, a trailblazer who had broken barriers for women in combat roles long before John had even considered military service. "Thank you, ma'am," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Colonel Davis leaned forward, resting her elbows on the polished wooden desk. "Have you considered advanced programs? Scout sniper, competitive shooting, tactical teens? Each offers something different. Your particular skill set could be valuable in several specialized areas. John's heart pounded against her ribcage. Just weeks ago, she'd been the butt of jokes, the recruit nobody took seriously. Now, a decorated officer was discussing career paths she hadn't dared imagine. "I'm not sure I even know all the options, ma'am," she admitted, feeling both overwhelmed and exhilarated by the possibilities suddenly opening before her. The colonel's expression softened slightly, a rare break in her professional demeanor. "You'll find out soon enough." She picked up a folder and made a notation. "For now, you'll join the Advanced Marksmanship Group. Staff Sergeant Patrick Brown runs it. He's one of the best instructors we have. Demanding, but fair." John nodded, processing what this meant. Longer days, tougher drills, and training alongside seasoned soldiers who might be just as skeptical as her fellow recruits had initially been. "It won't be easy," Colonel Davis continued, studying John's reaction. "You'll be training with soldiers who have years of experience. Some have combat deployments. They won't care about your natural talent. They'll only respect results." "I understand, ma'am." The base commander stood, signaling the end of their meeting. "Sergeant Johnson believes in you. That carries weight with me." She extended her hand across the desk. "Don't make him or me regret this opportunity." John shook the colonel's hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of a woman who had earned every accolade adorning her walls. "Report to the advanced range at 0500 tomorrow," Colonel Davis instructed. "And Smith, pack extra socks. The days are long, and blisters won't earn you any sympathy." As John left the office, the magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. This wasn't just a chance to prove herself. It was an opportunity to redefine what was possible. The Advanced Marksmanship Group was indeed a world apart. 8 men, all older and battle-tested, with hardened expressions and the quiet confidence that came only from experience. John Smith felt her throat tighten as she approached the separate training area, cordoned off from the regular recruits. This wasn't basic training anymore. These were specialists. Staff Sergeant Patrick Brown stood at the center, a compact man with eyes that missed nothing. His weathered face remained expressionless as John approached. Unlike the other instructors, he didn't tower over her, but his presence commanded immediate respect. "So, you're the one everyone's talking about," he said, studying her with clinical precision. "Let's see if the stories match reality." The first exercise was unlike anything she'd faced before. A complex obstacle course stretched before them, with targets appearing at unpredictable moments, from awkward angles, all while a merciless timer counted down. This wasn't standing at a firing line. This was combat simulation. "You'll engage 10 targets while navigating the course," Brown explained. "Speed matters, but accuracy decides whether you live or die in the field." Tommy Garcia went first. The veteran from Nebraska moved with practiced efficiency, his movements economical as he slid between barriers and dropped to firing positions. 7 hits out of 10, a solid performance that drew appreciative nods from the others. "Not bad for an old man," someone muttered, earning a rare smile from Tommy. Michael Lee followed, his reputation preceding him. The sniper school graduate flowed through the course like water, finding angles others missed. 9 hits, nearly perfect. He finished with barely a drop of sweat on his brow. John watched intently, memorizing their techniques, noting how they used cover, how they controlled their breathing between bursts of exertion. Her heart hammered against her ribs as Brown called her name. "Smith, you're up." The weight of 8 evaluating gazes pressed down on her shoulders as she approached the starting line. The rifle felt different today, heavier with expectation. "Begin," Brown commanded, starting the timer. John moved forward, her smaller frame allowing her to slip through gaps the men had to maneuver around. She found shooting positions that suited her build, stabilizing the weapon against structures in ways the taller soldiers couldn't. The first target appeared. She exhaled and squeezed. Hit. The second emerged behind a barrier. Another hit. She missed the third, adjusting too slowly, but recovered for the fourth and fifth. As she progressed, something unexpected happened. The world narrowed to just her, the weapon, and the targets. The pressure, the watching eyes, even her own doubts faded away. When she finished, 8 hits out of 10 shone on the electronic scoreboard, equal to some of the veterans, better than others. The group's skepticism visibly shifted, replaced by the first genuine hints of professional respect. This wasn't beginner's luck. This was skill. When John Smith's turn came, the pressure was crushing. Every pair of eyes on the advanced marksmanship course fixed on her small frame as she approached the starting position. These weren't raw recruits struggling through basic training. These were soldiers who'd earned their stripes through years of service and combat deployments. "Timer starts on my mark," Staff Sergeant Patrick Brown called out, his compact figure standing rigidly at the edge of the course. "Remember, this isn't just about hitting targets. It's about movement, adaptation, and decision-making under pressure." John took a deep breath, feeling the weight of expectation. Tommy Garcia had just completed the course with impressive efficiency, and Michael Lee's performance had been nearly flawless. Now it was her turn to prove she belonged. The whistle blew, and she sprang into action. Where the larger men had powered through obstacles with brute strength, John used her smaller size to her advantage. She slipped through narrow gaps that had forced others to go around, ducking under barriers rather than climbing over them. Each movement was deliberate yet fluid, conserving energy for the moments that mattered most. At the first firing position, she dropped to her stomach and lined up her shot in half the time it had taken some of the veterans. The rifle felt like an extension of her body as she squeezed the trigger. Hit. She was already moving before the target stopped swinging. "Look at Smith go," someone muttered as she navigated a tricky section that had slowed down even Michael Lee. The young recruit found unconventional shooting positions that accommodated her frame, perching on obstacles that others had used as cover, finding angles that turned her height into an advantage rather than a limitation. When she reached the final station, a series of 3 targets at varying distances with a crosswind complicating the shots, John let instinct guide her aim. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. "Feel the wind, don't fight it." 2 clean hits. The third shot clipped the edge of the target. Not perfect, but enough. She finished with 8 out of 10, her breathing controlled despite the exertion. As she set down her weapon, the silence was deafening. Then Tommy nodded, a simple gesture that carried more weight than any verbal praise. 8 out of 10, Smith. Solid work," Staff Sergeant Brown said, making a notation on his clipboard. His face remained impassive, but there was a new note in his voice: respect. The group's skepticism was fading, replaced by something John hadn't experienced before in her military career: acceptance. This wasn't beginner's luck or a fluke performance on a simple range. This was real skill, forged in adversity and honed through determination. As she rejoined the group, Michael Lee gave her a slight nod. "Nice shooting," he said quietly. "Where'd you learn to move like that?" For the first time, the question contained no mockery, only professional curiosity. Over the next weeks, the intensity of training escalated to levels John Smith had never imagined. Dawn arrived with grueling physical conditioning, followed by technical instruction that stretched well into the evening. She learned to calculate wind drift at extreme distances, to compensate for humidity and barometric pressure, and to read terrain like a second language. The night shooting exercises proved particularly challenging. Fitted with night vision devices that bathed the world in eerie green light, most recruits struggled with the disorienting perspective. Tommy Garcia, despite his years of experience, cursed under his breath as his shots strayed from their marks. Even Michael Lee, with his sniper school credentials, found the adjustment difficult. "It's like trying to thread a needle while looking through a fishbowl," one recruit muttered after a particularly frustrating session. But for John, something unexpected happened in the darkness. The world narrowed, distractions fell away, and her focus crystallized. The quiet of night seemed to amplify her concentration rather than hinder it. While others fought against the equipment, she adapted, letting her body find its natural rhythm. 300 yards, moving target, Staff Sergeant Brown announced one evening, his voice cutting through the Nebraska night air. The challenge seemed nearly impossible, a small silhouette moving erratically across the range, visible only through the green haze of night vision. One by one, the veterans attempted the shot. Tommy managed to clip the target once in 5 attempts. Michael Lee hit it twice, earning grudging nods from the group. When John's turn came, she settled into position, her small frame finding stability where others couldn't. Her first shot missed, but she adjusted immediately. The second struck true, then the third, and the fourth. By her 5th shot, a hush had fallen over the training ground. 4 out of 5, Staff Sergeant Brown announced, his typically stern expression softening slightly. Best of the night. Later, as the group cleaned their weapons, Brown approached John. His compact figure cast a long shadow in the dim light of the equipment shed. "Smith, a word," he said, gesturing for her to follow. Away from the others, the instructor studied her with sharp eyes. "You've got something rare. Natural talent, yes, but more than that. Adaptability, patience, the kind of calm under pressure that can't be taught." John waited, sensing there was more. "I want to recommend you for Scout Sniper School," he continued. "It's the most demanding program there is. Most who try wash out within weeks." The words hung in the air between them. An opportunity and a challenge rolled into one. For a moment, John thought about how far she'd come from being the recruit everyone laughed at. Now, one of the military's most respected instructors was offering her a chance at elite status. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," she replied, her quiet voice steady. What would that entail? The offer from Staff Sergeant Patrick Brown hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and danger. John Smith felt her heart racing as she processed his words. "The failure rate is 70%, Brown warned, his compact frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. Physical, mental, and academic pressure like nothing else. And you'd be the first woman ever to attempt it." The first woman? The words echoed in her mind as she considered how far she'd come. Just months ago, she'd been the butt of jokes, the petite recruit everyone expected to wash out before the first week ended. Now she stood at the threshold of Scout Sniper School, a program so elite that most soldiers wouldn't even qualify to apply. "Most candidates train for years," the sergeant continued, his sharp eyes studying her reaction. "You'd have 3 months. The physical requirements alone break most men. 20-mile hikes with full gear, swimming tests in combat boots, sleep deprivation exercises." John thought of Michael Davis and his hunting stories, of Robert Brown's bicep flexing as he'd lifted the rifle that first day. How they'd laughed, how everyone had laughed. "Then there's the academic portion," Brown added. "Ballistics, meteorology, mathematics. You'll calculate wind speed, humidity, temperature, and their effects on trajectory. Make the slightest error, and you fail." The training ground around them had emptied as other soldiers headed to the mess hall. In the distance, the Nebraska plains stretched toward the horizon, reminding John of Montana skies and her grandfather's patient voice guiding her first shots. "What do I need to do to prepare?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. For the first time since she'd met him, Staff Sergeant Brown smiled, a small, tight expression that transformed his severe face. Now that's the right question. The next 3 months became a blur of transformation. Dawn found her running before others woke. Afternoons were spent in the library studying physics textbooks, and evenings dedicated to strength training that left her muscles screaming. Colonel Mary Davis arranged special permission for John to access the advanced ranges during off hours, where she practiced in all weather conditions. Sergeant Johnson checked in weekly, offering advice from his own training days. Mental toughness, he'd remind her. That's what separates the elite from the rest. Some nights, exhausted beyond measure, John would stare at the barracks ceiling, wondering if she was chasing an impossible dream. But each morning, she rose before her alarm, driven by a determination that had been forged in the crucible of doubt and dismissal. This wasn't just about proving others wrong anymore. It was about proving something to herself, that limitations existed only in the mind, and that willpower could overcome any obstacle. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds as John Smith approached the gates of Scout Sniper School. 3 months of grueling preparation had transformed her, not physically, as she remained the same 5'2" recruit who'd first arrived at camp, but in ways that couldn't be measured. Her confidence was no longer fragile. It had been forged in the fire of doubt and tempered by achievement. A group of instructors stood watching the new arrivals, their faces impassive. Among them, she recognized Staff Sergeant Brown, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. The gesture carried more weight than any lengthy speech of encouragement. "Smith!" called a voice from behind. She turned to see Sergeant Johnson approaching with his characteristic purposeful stride. "Thought I'd see you off properly." "Thank you, sir," she replied, her quiet voice steady. "Remember what I told you. This program isn't about brute strength. It's about precision, patience, and adaptation." Johnson's weathered face softened momentarily. "You've got those in spades." John glanced at the other candidates gathering near the entrance. All men, all larger, all carrying themselves with the confidence of soldiers who'd never been underestimated. Some eyed her with curiosity, others with skepticism. The looks were familiar, but they no longer penetrated her armor. "Your grandfather would be proud," Johnson added, mentioning the Korean War veteran who'd first placed a rifle in her hands on that Montana ranch years ago. She thought about how far she'd come from those first days at camp, from the snickering comments of Michael Davis about her size, from Robert Brown's dismissive glances, from Daniel Garcia's mocking princess comments. The same men who'd laughed when she picked up her first military rifle had fallen silent when she outshot them all. Colonel Davis had been right when she'd pulled John into her office weeks ago. Sometimes the military needs to be reminded that excellence comes in unexpected packages. As the instructors called for the candidates to assemble, John took her place in line. The weight of her pack felt lighter than the burden of doubt she'd carried for so long. She knew the statistics. 70% would fail this program. The physical demands would push her to breaking points she hadn't yet discovered. The mental challenges would test every ounce of her resolve. But as she stepped through those gates, following the stern-faced instructor who barked orders to the new class, John felt something unexpected. Freedom. Freedom from having to prove her basic worth. She had earned her place here, just like everyone else. The girl they had mocked for picking up a rifle was about to rewrite the definition of what a soldier could be, not with grand speeches or demands for respect, but one perfect shot at a time.